Okay, thank you, everybody. And thank you, everybody, from being with us with our digital event on the root causes and the roots of anti-Semitism on conspiracy theories, or the roots of conspiracy theories on anti-Semitism. This is a very special day, since today it is exactly 2 months ago that we have seen the horrific attacks of Hamas on the Israeli people, unprovoked attacks. Well, yesterday I went on as an invitation by the Israeli government to see the raw images of this horrific attack. And the fact that today it's only 2 months ago really struck something with me when you really see these vicious images. So we're talking today about this very important subject that we have seen since October 7, which is the rise of anti-Semitism. We've seen the rise of anti-Semitism coming from either the far left, coming from the far right, coming from the surge of radical Islamism. And especially since the attacks, we have seen this strong increase. And what I have seen as a politician is that most people are not aware that they spread and enable anti-Semitic theories, anti-Semitic remarks, anti-Semitic opinions. We see it spread on social media. We see it spread in conspiracy theories, while at the same time giving people a feeling of assurance in a world that is ever changing. And as a politician, I very much saw this as the consequence of the COVID crisis, for example, where we saw anti-vax theories very much connected and intertwined with anti-Semitism. So this event today, this digital event today, will hopefully create some awareness of anti-Semitism and the connection it has to these spread conspiracy theories. So today with me, I have Alex Hearn. Alex Hearn, you have come all the way from London with us. You are the director of Labour Against Antisemitism, and you will present a fascinating lecture about the historical origins, the philosophical explanations, and the political implications about anti-Semitism. Very much glad that you are here and will give us this very important, deep historic lecture. We'll take about 45 minutes. I know it's a little bit longer than the typical internet attention span we have nowadays, but please bear with Alex. We had a very long telephone conversation not that long ago, and for me it already changed a lot on how I look at the world and how I look at how conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism is spread. And next to me I also have Alex Benjamin. You're from the European Jewish Association. You will provide the audience with some opening remarks. Then we will move to Alex Hearn. So and then afterwards, maybe we can have some questions from the online audience or from the people here on how we will, and you can both answer these questions. So please, Alex Benjamin, you have the floor first.
So thank you very much, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you. Just to say from the outset, as well as it being an important day marking the sort of anniversary of the terror attacks in Israel, it's also, in a couple of hours, the first night of Hanukkah, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, which celebrates the victory of light over darkness. So it seems like an appropriate time to have this meeting. Anyway, good afternoon, first and foremost. Once again, thank you to Michael for hosting this timely event. Thank you to Anna and the team in Michael's office too for your work in pulling it all together. It's extremely important. I'm not going to take too long, but I just wanted to outline a few points for you, because in a couple of minutes you're going to be hearing from Alex Hearn, who's a good friend of mine, also to my mind the single best source for tracing the roots of the oldest hatred, which is of course anti-Semitism. For a Jewish community's point of view, it's been an awful couple of months since the Hamas massacre, and as a director at the European Jewish Association, I've heard real horror stories from our communities, Jewish homes daubed with swastikas or Stars of David. We have reported anti-Semitic incidents in Alex Hearn's own country, the United Kingdom, up by 1,300%. In France, to give you a sense of things, since October the 7th, the number of incidents in 2 months is 3 times higher than the total for the entire year in 2022. And it's like this all over Europe right now. While the numbers are at insane levels, it's, truth be told, we regularly see spikes in anti-Semitism at different times. The last big spike occurred during the COVID pandemic, where Jews were blamed for the pandemic, either for causing it, profiting from it, or from being immune to it. We were not, obviously, because I ended up catching COVID twice. But we've seen this script before, many times, specifically with the bubonic plague. When it hit Europe centuries ago, we got the same accusations. We were poisoning wells, or somehow Jews were immune. I'm not going to eat into too much of Alex's presentation because he might be covering some of these points. But the main thing is anti-Semitism is known as the oldest hatred because it's been around since ancient Egypt. It runs like a seam through history. Romans, Greeks, the advent of Christianity, the advent of Islam, the Crusades, Inquisitions, pogroms, Dreyfus Affair, the Nazis, the far right, the far left, Islamic fundamentalism, Arab nationalism, and so it goes on and on and on. It's so pervasive and so difficult to combat because anti-Semitism adapts itself to every possible scenario. To give you an idea, Jews can be rich exploiters, or they can be poor, flea-infested drains on the economy. We killed God, we rejected God, but we think we're God's chosen people. We're capitalists, but we can also be communists. I don't know if you guys know, but there's an old joke about 2 poor Jews in Poland sitting during World War II, reading the Nazi newspaper, Die Stürme. One of the friends turns to the other one and says, "What the hell are you reading this newspaper for?" His friend replied, "It makes me happy to read it, because I might be poor, but in here it says we run the government, we run the world, we run the banks." As usual, with jokes, the best ones often reflect a bitter irony. Of course, we Jews now, the caricature goes, is that we're all rich. We're a cabal that looks out only for itself. We run Hollywood, the banks, big companies. And lately, we've also become colonizers, Nazis, child killers, organ harvesters, and world poisoners in the Middle East. Regrettably, this is nothing new, as you're about to hear shortly. It's always interesting for me personally to hear anti-Semitism, some of it mildly amusing, some of it from the wow, where the hell did that come from category, and some of it just patently sinister. Let me say that I don't always wear this as keeper on my head, but it's utterly amazing what difference it makes when I wear it and when I don't. When I'm wearing it, people tend to stare a bit more. I get more dirty looks from certain people, and some people just say, here in Belgium, "Regarde un juif," look, a Jew. When I'm not, I kind of have a privileged insight in that I get to see hidden, or oftentimes not so hidden, anti-Semitism that people might not say to me if I was wearing it. Briefly, let's go to the mildly amusing. My wife is Czech, and oftentimes when I'm there and people find out I'm Jewish, the question immediately follows, "Do you have any good stock market tips?" But where the hell did that come from? I used to work here, and I had a Hebrew sticker for a beer company on my door here in the European Parliament. This is a true story, absolutely 100% true, by the way. I have no reason to make anything up here. A colleague comes in with a very, very serious look on her face, and she shuts the door. "You're Jewish, right?" "Yes." "So listen, my dad is having problems with a business partner." So I'm thinking to myself, oh God, I can see where this one's going. She continued, "So I heard if a Jew curses somebody, it can really work." Well, you can imagine I was completely shocked. And I started looking around for a hidden camera because I thought I might be in one of these sort of, candid camera programs. And I answered sarcastically in the best way that I could. I said, well, yes, it's actually true, but it only works amongst us Jews. And deadly serious, she says to me, right, but I heard you can also pick the sex of your babies. Then we just get down to the downright sinister. My daughter likes to go to playgrounds, and beside this playground where we sometimes go to, there's a disused tram where you can buy drinks and food. After a while, I got to know a guy who was working up there. My Jewishness never came up. COVID has started and we were talking about its impact. He then turns to me and says, there's Rothschild money behind all this, you know. They're working with Bill Gates. Safe to say I never went back again. Ladies and gentlemen, from the apparently harmless to the ignorant to the conspiratorial, anti-Semitism covers all bases. It's an all-encompassing hate, and it's a form of ignorance without pareil. Where does it all come from? Well, I personally can't wait to hear Alex Hearn lay it all out for you. From my point of view, thank you for now, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later as they come up. So thank you for your attention. Michael.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you so much for sharing these stories, who are, well, unfortunately part of the everyday lives of many Jewish people, especially, unfortunately, as well in Europe. So thank you. We now move to our main speaker, our main lecturer for today, and that is Alex Hearn. When we first talked to each other on the phone, I actually introduced myself as a right-wing 80s, a right-wing politician, an 80s right-wing politician stuck in the 21st century. And you said, oh, so you're nowadays called a moderate. And which is actually quite funny because you tend to be a bit more on the left spectrum of the political spectrum. But we deeply share the fight against anti-Semitism. And you shared with me some deep historic knowledge on anti-Semitism, where it comes from, where it originates, and where it still spreads today. Again, while many people think they are not anti-Semitic, they are still enablers of being of anti-Semitic theories on actually spreading conspiracy theories that tend to have underlying anti-Semitic thoughts and ideology. So for the next 45 minutes, we're all here, and we look forward to your lecture. And well, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. This was not the talk which I planned to give. I planned to give an entirely different talk. However, we now live in a different world, especially Jewish people, since October the 7th. So here we are. I want to talk about the most dangerous image in the world. There is a poster which is so dangerous that people all over the world have been frantically removing it as soon as it appears. You may have unwittingly walked past one of these posters. I did on the way to a conference. You might wonder what kind of terrible image might provoke such a visceral reaction in people. Is it an image which is so terrible that it can harm impressionable minds, or maybe it incites violence? These are, of course, missing posters. And the faces are of children, babies, families, the elderly. This is the photo of the one which I walked past, while other posters around it remained untouched. You probably have images, much like these ones, in your phones. They are normal people. And that's why these images are so dangerous, because it humanizes Jewish people. And in the face of a campaign of dehumanization, a missing poster of a Jewish person looking entirely normal is like kryptonite. As an Israeli said to me on after October the 7th, the day after, he said, Hamas don't see us as humans. And shortly after, I found out that there are many people across the Western world who also don't see us as humans, hence the missing posters. I even made a TikTok video which went semi-viral about these missing posters, and that got mass reported and removed. So the story of the missing posters also went missing. Another troubling aspect of this is how institutions are failing us. Here is not just dehumanization, but a public display of hate. Just let that sink in for a minute. Twice in the UK, the police have been filmed removing posters as well. And I saw footage from Germany too. Amnesty officials were caught doing the same in Italy. Some people prefer disfiguring these posters. I've seen some very upsetting images of children with feces on the posters, an image of a child who it transpired had been tortured and murdered by Hamas with horns drawn on his image. That's right, like medieval anti-Semitism. Another person was filmed writing colonizer on the poster of a baby. The reason that people write colonizer and occupier on the images of children and babies and families and Hitler moustaches on toddlers, Hitler being the secular Satan for them, is that it's the most evil thing that they can think of. That's how they're dehumanizing these families once again. And so they're making babies, Jewish babies, into the concept of evil. And that is the story of anti-Semitism. The Jews become the Jews, a concept symbolizing all that is evil. And so the most dangerous image in the world is a normal Jewish face. In the anti-Semitic mind, there is a hierarchy. And on the same lamppost, you can have a missing dog poster staying up. And on the other side of that very same lamppost, the face of a Jewish missing person is removed. In other words, the Jewish person is seen less than an animal. The Nazis, of course, had a word for this. This was subhuman. A man called Alex Jones harassed the parents of children killed in the Sandy Hook massacre in the States and was fined $965 million. And it seems that globally, people have turned into some kind of Alex Jones figure, not believing the news reports about what they've seen, not believing the massacre, not believing the rapes, saying, well, I know I've seen the body of a toddler, but I haven't seen the toddler being killed. I haven't seen the footage. Why can't they just accept that people have been kidnapped and other people are concerned? It's something very, very disturbing, because what it is a denial of reality. And this dislocation of truth is so very important to all of us because it causes irrational thinking. And irrational thinking can manifest in violence. It can manifest in people gathering outside a falafel shop to shout genocide at them, as happened recently in the States, because they donated money to an Israeli ambulance volunteer service. And it's a sign that we're losing democracy, to put it quite bluntly, because you can't solve real issues if people are denying reality. You can't lobby your government about something that isn't real. Instead, people blame Jews for their own massacre. And there is a familiarity with the taunting of Holocaust denial. As Primo Levi remembered being told by an SS officer, and even if some proof should remain and some of you survive, people will say that the events you describe are too monstrous to be believed. They will say They are the exaggerations of Allied propaganda and will believe us, who will deny everything, and not you. So now I'd like to talk about contemporary anti-Semitism and what it is. And it's sometimes called anti-Zionism. There used to be something called the Jewish question. And this was how intellectuals framed their anti-Semitism as legitimate discourse. They would ask, how exactly do Jews harm the world? And what can be done to stop them? Do we remove their rights, assimilate them, or kill them maybe? It should have, of course, been called the German question, the French question, or the British question, and so on, because the real question was why they wouldn't accept Jews for their own shortcomings and why they had to blame the Jews. Now, the Jewish question has returned in a funny way, and I call it the Jewish state question. And it asks how the Jewish state harms humanity and what should be done about it. And to these people, Israel becomes the symbol of Jewish degeneracy, which they fantasize about. It was, of course, a backlash to Jewish emancipation, but emancipation is not a temporary thing. And this is because post-Holocaust, attacking Jews as individuals became socially unacceptable. So this was a more acceptable way of doing it. And instead, they portrayed the Jewish state as uniquely evil for deniability. Of course, the end result is still attacks on Jews, as we are seeing. Anti-Zionism has become like an ism for the disaffected to rally around. And Israel has become, for them, a symbol of global oppression. All the bad things in the world compared to Nazism and apartheid. And also, it's an ideological worldview, which means that you can connect it to anything. So, Greta Thunberg, for instance, demonized Israel as against climate justice, despite it being at the forefront of green technology. And this is why academics believe it's integral to their professional and personal worldview. People define themselves in opposition to it, like people used to define their religion in opposition to Jews. Then they defined their race in opposition to Jews. And now they define their politics in opposition to Jews. It's a multi-layered structure, and it's always the latest trend. Some people, as we saw with the American Ivy State University presidents, accept demonizing falsehoods about Israel and Jews without question. And when asked if genocide of Jews was allowed on their campuses, there was but. There was context. And this is where we are right now. These norms and this discourse is now acceptable, and going against it can feel like swimming against the tide and can be a risk to some people. And the people that's saying it, well, they get to identify as anti-racists, but Jews, we don't get to self-identify as Zionists if we are Zionists. Instead, we're given a hostile identity, imperialist, racist, colonizers, and we have to disavow that part of our identity in those hostile terms. Now, anti-Zionists try to disassociate themselves from previous forms of anti-Semitism. They say this time it's warranted. This time it's liberation. This time it's deserved. And that's exactly what the people last time said, funnily enough. They deny the links, but they use the same language and the same imagery. It's no coincidence that this image that I'm showing you, which originated with the British neo-Nazi National Front, has been adopted by anti-Zionism. I saw it used 14 times in rallies across the world that I counted personally. It uses the language of purity, semi-medical language. Keep the world clean, as if Jews are making the world dirty. And this takes me back to being at school and being called Dirty Jew. And there it is in a picture about a country, the only Jewish country in the world. This is why the far right all over the world have readopted anti-Zionism. And I'll explain later why it's a readoption. They've seen how powerful it is and that it's a really good vehicle for hate, which is socially acceptable. And so you can see that from Italian fascists to the Polish anti-vax march, where the killing of Jews was called for, to the American neo-Nazi Andrew Anglin, who writes the Daily Stormer. He was banned from X, formerly Twitter, and his first tweet back, it wasn't Jews, it was Zionists. And so Israel, in a secular Western society, becomes the new devil. And like other forms of anti-Semitism, this is a passion for people, and it's a passion which they take comfort from. And the reason is, people can't stand the idea that they live in a world where no one's in charge, an unpredictable world. They want the world to be simple. That's where conspiracy theories come in handy. Everything has an easy explanation, a simple explanation, and the world just isn't like that. So the idea that some evil Jews are controlling everything is preferable to the idea that you're driving in a car and there's no one in control at all. Everyone is at risk from an irrational ideology. And so even a McChicken sandwich wrapper can become part of a plot to kill Palestinian children just because it's blue. So diners coming out of McDonald's, including children, can be shouted at by an angry mob. And not just in McDonald's, Starbucks and other places have failed this irrational purity test. So how did we get here? Well, anti-Zionism portrays Jews as evil, and it derives from Soviet anti-Semitic propaganda campaigns, which says that their version is that Jews are imperialist, white, colonizers, settlers, and Nazis. The left, some of the left, split the world into imperialist and anti-imperialist. On the imperialist side, you have countries like Britain, America, and Israel. And on the anti-imperialist side, you have countries like Iran, Russia, and people like Hamas. And that is why progressives can side with people who directly oppose their values, and not only that, who actually want to kill them. There was a recent march in London, and some people put up a gay pride flag, and it got snatched within seconds and stamped on. Now I'm going to talk about the 7 milestones of anti-Zionism, and I'll prove that anti-Zionism existed long before Zionism, which was the political reality of Israel, the existence of an actual country rather than an idea and a concept of a homeland. In 2001 was the UN Durban Conference Against Racism, and this had been heavily influenced by the build-up conference in Tehran, where Jews and Israelis were not invited until after the conference had finished. The subsequent Durban UN conference, which was based around that, was described by the American delegate and Holocaust survivor, Tom Lantos, as the most sickening display of anti-Semitism he had experienced since the Holocaust. You can imagine how bad that was. Jewish delegates were intimidated, harassed, and abused. Anti-Semitic literature, including the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was available at conference stands. Anti-Semitic leaflets were given out. Swastikas were taped to the wall. And a 20,000 person crowd unveiled a Hitler was right banner. It was here in 2001, in an anti-racism conference by the UN, that calling Israel an apartheid state and accusing it of the sole source of wrongdoing at the expense of all other causes, became the cause of the day. Amnesty and other NGOs signed a declaration calling Israel a racist apartheid state guilty of genocide. So what Durban did is it restarted the Soviet anti-Semitic campaign from 1975, which was passed by the UN, Zionism is racism, and it was rescinded, but it came back in this new guise. And so we see this quote: the Torah, which is the Jewish scriptures, is an unsurpassed textbook of bloodthirstiness, hypocrisy, treachery, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm a bit tired, so you guys are going to help me at this point. It's quiz time. So liven up. I'm going to have a show of hands, please. Who thinks this is a left-wing quote? Who thinks this is a quote from a left-winger? Can I have a show of hands, please? Does anyone think this is a quote from a right-winger? Can we have a show of hands? And anyone think this is religious hate? Well, yes, you're correct. Of course, it is religious hate, but it's actually from the left. It's a Soviet piece of writing called The Encroaching Counter-Revolution from 1974. This is our second milestone, and it's Soviet anti-Semitism. And the anti-Semitism of much of the left derived from Soviet anti-Semitism. This reached another level after 1967, when the Soviets realized that Israel was not going to become another communist outpost and turn their faces strongly against it. And what they said was that Israel was Nazi, illegitimate, and imperialist. Now, obviously, Putin was a lieutenant in the KGB. So when Ukraine happened, he also called them Nazi, illegitimate, and imperialist, because you can just reuse these things. Maybe they don't have quite the same impact. Such was its power that anti-Semitism was central to Soviet propaganda. The KGB, as Isabella Tabarovsky, a historian, says, had many known Hitler admirers. So their Nazi propaganda, they needed plausible deniability. They needed space after the war. So they called it anti-Zionism. So whereas the Nazis opposed Chagall as an assault on Western civilization, the Soviets opposed Chagall's art as being opposed to Zionism. It even got a scientific sounding name, Zionology, because everyone knows you put an ology on the end of something, it sounds real, right? And the material became mandatory reading in the Soviet Union. Books, brochures, articles were published in many languages, and many linked to Caution Zionism, which was written by the Central Committee. Yuri Ivanov was the deputy of military intelligence, and his colleagues called him the main Yidologist of the Soviet Union. So today, we see the same idea as Zionology manifested, and there is an institute for the critical study of Zionism. Now, their very first conference showed their irrational norms, with attendees having to pass a Soviet-style purity test and pledge allegiance to anti-Zionism. No dissent allowed. What kind of academia is that? Bad academia. And how did this end in the Soviet Union? How did this roll out? Well, Jews were targeted for an ongoing campaign of exclusion and execution, even if they were ideologically pure. For example, Slansky was general secretary who ran communism in Czechoslovakia. He and 10 other Jewish leaders were executed, accused of Zionism, and suffered show trials. So socialist purity and anti-Zionist purity offered them no protection, and the same went for the leaders of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. They didn't even bother giving them show trials, so ridiculous was the idea. And so forced assimilation and demonization was the Soviet answer to the Jewish question. And we see these same campaigns played out on campus today. Organizations like SJP borrow this for their social media campaigns to shame and exclude Jews who are Zionists. Of course, whatever your intention, if you're going to ban Zionist groups as which happened in Britain during the 1980s, the effect is anti-Semitic. You're banning Jewish groups. Now I'm going to give you another quote. The Zionists try to make the rest of the world believe that the national consciousness of the Jews finds its satisfaction in the creation of a Palestinian state. Can we have a show of hands for people who think this is from a left-wing politician, please? And can we have a show of hands who thinks this is from a right-wing politician? Okay, so not one single person thought it was a right-wing politician, but the answer is it was Adolf Hitler, and it was written in Mein Kampf. It's an easy mistake to make because the Nazis also rallied against the idea of a Jewish state, and they also said it was illegitimate and imperialist. And this brings us on to our next milestone, our third milestone. This looks like a kind of maybe a US neo-Nazi or white supremacist flag to me, but it's not. It's the Syrian Social Nationalist Party flag, still the second biggest party in Syria, and it was a fascist-style party founded in the 30s. And the same went for many other parties, like the Ba'ath Party, which rules Syria to this day. And the still influential Muslim Brotherhood, founded by al-Banna. He translated Nazi propaganda such as Der Stürmer and Mein Kampf, which he retitled My Jihad. Now, the Nazis directly funded this group and their anti-Jewish violence, and the Brotherhood used the slogan, Jews out of Egypt and Palestine. And to give you an idea, Hamas eventually became their armed wing in Palestine. So, to give you an overview, Arab nationalism peaked in the 1920s. And as you can see from this newspaper clipping from 1934, boycotts against Jews living in the region of Jerusalem and the surrounding region did not need Israel. BDS was already a thing. The Grand Mufti started planning violence against Jews as early as 1919. It was he who began the rumor that the Jews were planning to storm Al-Aqsa as a pretext to eliminate the ancient Jewish community of Hebron in 1929, which you can see from that news clipping as well. And this incitement to anti-Jewish violence still continues to this day. We see it posted on Twitter and on social media. And the Mufti had his own SS division and planned the Holocaust of Jews directly in the region with Hitler. But the underreported part of this story is the levels of Nazi propaganda that went on. And it was a little bit different to European anti-Semitism because Jews had inferior status in the Middle East, a bit like medieval Europe had. They had a precarious situation. But there was no secular revolution. There was no equal rights or any of this. So the idea of Jewish power just didn't resonate the same in the Middle East like it did with Europe. So the Nazis ran a massive campaign to link Jews as a threat to the Quran, as a threat to Islam, and created a radical new interpretation of the Quran, and with it, radical anti-Zionism. A good example of that is the book Islam and Judaism in 1937, which they produced. But the really key part here is their radio broadcasts, where they use trusted figures such as the Mufti, because it was the new tech of the day and literacy rates were not high. And this is a way to get the message out across cafes and marketplaces, etc., etc. And to give you an idea of its importance, the Nazi department for this radio broadcast alone was 255 people. They also dropped and distributed millions of leaflets across the region, 700,000 at a time in some cases, with messages such as "kill the Jews before they kill you," to smooth the way for the Holocaust as they had done in Europe. So what happened is it created this really unique blend of European anti-Semitism, Arab nationalism, and this radical new Islamism. I'm going to read you word for word a US intelligence report on Nazi propaganda. And it said that interwoven into every program is the Jewish menace. The Zionist question provides the basic theme. This is the legacy of Nazi propaganda in the Middle East. Unlike Europe, there was no denazification of Arab Nazis and collaborators, and they took senior positions, such as in the Arab Higher Committee. And then post-war, countries like Egypt and Syria hired top Nazis for their war against the Jewish state, such as Eichmann's right-hand man, Aloy Brunner, who joined Assad Senior in Syria, and propagandists for Goebbels, Johann von Leers, went to Egypt, and so did top people from the Gestapo, like Leopold Gleam. And the Muslim Brotherhood arranged a huge street rally to push the Arab coalition into rejecting the two-state solution with Israel and silenced opposing voices with threats. So you could argue, as historian Matthias Kunzel does, that the ensuing conflict was a result of the Nazi legacy. And my next milestone is the protocols. The Nazis and the Soviets both drew from the same source material, the Elders of the Protocols of Zion. And it was written in 1903 by the Tsar's secret police. And the reason it was written was because his power was so weakened. And in 1897, we have the first Zionist Congress. And this is the reason why it's one of the milestones, because the protocols pretended to be minutes from the first Zionist Congress. And it's actually recycled dialogue from a French political satire. It was no such thing. There was no private meeting. It was an open meeting. There were non-Jewish journalists there. This was all debunked by the Times newspaper. And what it's about is Jewish power, international Jewish leaders conspiring against the state, making secret plans to infiltrate all aspects of society and to rule the world. And these are the themes that we really see are coming back today in a strong way. And that Jews are responsible for the changes in society. So this was also evident in the anti-Bolshevik White Army expression, beat the Jews and save Russia. The idea that the only obstacle to them having their counter-revolution was the Jews. And of course, what happened with the Russian Revolution is that people fleeing took copies of the protocols with them and spread them across the world. Now, the protocols influenced Hitler. He used it for Nazi propaganda with the idea of the puppeteer Jew controlling events. He believed it was him or the Jews. And we can see this published on social media, the same puppeteer idea by Fox News. And we see it in some anti-Zionist literature too. If you want to know the power of the protocols, well, the Pittsburgh gunman held Jews responsible for white suffering, the Codyville gunman held Jews responsible for Muslim suffering, and the Jersey gunman held Jews responsible for black suffering. QAnon also uses the protocols. Their ideas are spread globally, with the Jewish elite held responsible for hidden nefarious power. Now, these days, we have what I call the Israel protocols, which adds the Jewish state to Jewish power. And it's clear from Soviet propaganda that their protocols simply substitute the word Jew for Zionist. So you get the sinister role of international Zionism instead of international Jewry, which is what the Nazis would have said. There were also common claims that Jewish power was running the Labour Party on behalf of the Jewish state and undermining Britain, a very protocols idea. And for social media, the protocols are commonly represented in a meme by all across the political spectrum. And it usually shows people of influence, like politicians or business leaders, and they have a star next to them, or maybe the Israel flag. And the idea is to show that Jews are infiltrating and controlling the world. BDS Boston created a map linking Jews to corporations and Jewish charities to corporations such as Apple. If in your mind you think of networks of Jewish power, then you will end up with lists and maps of Jews. David Miller was an academic who claimed that making chicken soup was a Zionist plot and that Jewish students were agents of Israel. He was a professor at Bristol University, and he can now be found on Iran state TV. This regular program talks about how all walks of life are controlled by Zionists. Ukraine, music, comedy, football, politics, anything you can think of. Think of it as the protocols for the digital age. They have about 11.5 million viewers on social media. And we also continue to have literature fantasizing about Jewish power. To this day, I would say that anti-Semitism has always been a bestseller. Over 500 years ago, the new tech of the printing press was introduced, and over time it created the roadmap to the Holocaust. Protocols thinking means Jews frequently have been portrayed as parasites and bloodsuckers of humanity, with their control being depicted as tentacles. Now, there's little difference between these portrayals because, again, it draws from the same source material. So the examples are Islamist, left, right, etc., etc. It goes on and on. And an interesting example is the alien reference, which was posted by someone who was in the Labour Party, but she borrowed it from a far-right website, and underneath stuff like Holocaust denial and use of the N-word, she asked for a higher resolution version of this image. And so you can see that these ideas just mutate, really. So now we get to pre-Zionism era. Decades before the protocols, in 1800s France, Jews gained rights, and leaving the ghetto was shown in anti-Rothschilds cartoons in the newspapers, and the Rothschilds were shown as leading the Jews out of Europe and to Israel. Of course, this was a ridiculous idea. The Rothschilds had fought so hard to become comfortable, had left the ghetto, and the idea that they were going to go to Israel to rebuild was nonsense. But the reason for me talking about this is because it was before Zionism had actually become a political movement. Now, the sixth milestone is blood libel. And you can see here how we see this focus on Israel being a child killer regime. The blood libel was created by a monk called Thomas of Monmouth in medieval Britain, and it said that Jewish scriptures required the blood of non-Jewish children so that the Jews could return to Israel and regain their self-determination and status. So think of it as kind of like a confidence crisis of a society. If you're openly Jewish, chances are, offline or online, you've been called a child killer. Post-Holocaust, as I said, the Jew is replaced by the Jewish state, but the end result is Jews are still being called child killer. Medieval Christendom focused on Jews being antichrist and closely associated with the devil. And it was said to be the ritual reenacting of the murder of Jesus by an international Jewish conspiracy, right? In medieval times, they were still talking about an international Jewish conspiracy. So it just shows you really that the technology of today, we have the internet, and yet it's just being used to carry the village of, well, a village of medieval peasants, really. So the blood libel template was a collaboration between the authorities and the ruling classes for financial benefits. It started in 1144, and the idea eventually spread across Europe, turning people into homicidal maniacs. And 100 years later, the King of England intervened in one case, and that is the reason why it became used in ballads and literature, such as the Canterbury Tales. And the success of this, of the blood libel, and of anti-Semitism in general, is how it recreates itself. So the same collective memory resurfaced with the Nazis, especially in 1934. They devoted a whole issue of Der Stürmer to it. And in 2005, a parliament had 20 members sign and submit a petition to ban all Jewish groups on the grounds of blood libel. And it was called the Letter of the 5,000. And the parliament was the Russian Duma. Although classic blood libel is less common in its original form, the ancient themes of bloodthirsty Jews and children lives on because it still causes a thrill. It's more common in its classic form across the Middle East, particularly by Islamist groups. So, for example, in 2003, Ash-Shatar was broadcast across the region in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan, and it depicted Jews murdering Christian children and draining their blood to make bread. And QAnon, as has been well publicized, the alt-right fixated on Jewish figures such as the Rothschilds as being responsible for the murder of children. People want to believe these lies about Jews like they want to believe in the tooth fairy. So you get this again across the board, a cartoon by the oldest Italian daily, a liberal newspaper, portraying Jesus as a baby being attacked by a tank with the Star of David on, saying, surely they don't want to kill me again. Ritual murder. It can be seen posted by the ex-former director of Al Jazeera. After 2,000 years, it's the same killer, we're told. And again, on a placard in an anti-Israel march, which says, do not let them do the same thing again. The New York Times ran an unprecedented front page about the Jewish state being child killers, and who couldn't fail to be moved by those images. It transpired that some were Israelis, some were killed by Hamas. A stock library image was used, and Facebook accounts revealed that some were militants posing with weapons and flags. So basic journalistic standards had failed, and they provided a distorted, sensationalized story with a terrible ancient resonance. In the past, they did it to get pilgrims to a cathedral, but now they're doing it for clicks. And my 7th milestone is Augustine. Bishop Augustine was the most important church father, and without him, Judaism may not have survived past the 5th century. He said that not all Jews should be murdered, but to keep them around, because their loss of land and loss of self-determination and loss of status showed that Christianity was the superior replacement. And so Judaism survived, but the theological basis for anti-Zionism was created, along with a kind of superiority complex which manifests when Jews are seen to be successful. So I thought I should talk about what is a Jew before, I'm telling you all these terrible things about what people say about Jews, but I haven't actually told you what a Jew is. So people have always speculated over Jewish identity and imagined what it means. A BBC TV debate even asked, are Jews an ethnic minority? So we've gone from being the wrong race to being, are we even a race? The panel didn't even include a Jew, by the way. So Jewish identity is such a rich tapestry that it can be incomprehensible to non-Jews. Jews are a people. We have many shared aspects, such as language, tradition, rituals, religion, land, and that's why Jews can take or leave any part that they like, and that's why you get atheist Jews, because we're not just a religion. Mostly we get called a religion because that's the framework which society hoisted upon us. When the secular revolution started, the deputy Clement Tonnerre said, refuse everything to Jews as a nation. So Judaism is inconvenient and can seem odd to outsiders, but actually we don't insist that you become like us to be a good person or to believe in our God to go to heaven or anything like that. We don't make any demands of non-Jews, but we're the ultimate counterculture surviving outside a hostile mainstream. Here's another quote for you. There will be absolutely no public office, even the highest ones, which Jews will not have usurped. Can we have a show of hands who thinks this is a quote from a left-winger, please? And can we have a show of hands who thinks this is a right-winger? I'm afraid the answer is left-wing, but he did inspire the Nazis, and the answer is Wilhelm Marr. He invented the word anti-Semitism, and the word anti-Semitism demonstrates to us the root of racist conspiracy theory. Wilhelm Marr was a left-wing agitator in the first German parliament, and in secular society, religious differences became acceptable. So Wilhelm Marr had to choose a different route, and he chose a racial emphasis to replace the existing word Jew hate. He wrongly assumed that the Semitic group of languages was a racial grouping opposite to Aryan, and so he invented the word anti-Semitism in the 1870s. He then founded the first political movement based on anti-Jewish beliefs, and the clue is in the name, the League of Anti-Semites. Marr then wrote The Victory of Judaism over Germandom in 1879, which said the Jews were trying to take over and must be defeated. The Jewish spirit, he said, and Jewish consciousness have overpowered the world. Now, the same lie, motivated by the fear of being replaced by Jews, was infamously given a new slogan in 2017 in Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us. This is, of course, the replacement theory, the white supremacist idea that Jews get non-white immigrants to replace white people. It's almost impossible for us, when talking about the first ideological case of anti-Semitism, it's almost impossible for us to understand how radical Christianity was. It turned the accepted order upside down and turned, for the first time, the oppressed became something worthy and the ruling class became something bad. And it gave us the society which we enjoy today, where the vulnerable are treated well and we have rights and liberties and all these wonderful things that we enjoy. And it's in the assumptions that we make and the values that we hold. But it also had an element, which is the element that I'm here to talk to you about, and that is about Jews. Because even in a secular society, the cultural heritage of these concepts live on. So early Christianity had to distance itself from Judaism for protection from the Roman Empire, the superpower of its time, and to stop losing followers, because Judaism was the biggest show in town. So the Apostle Paul's message was to de-Judaize yourself and the world by guarding from the Jewishness within yourself and others, i.e., they didn't want to lose more followers. And this is why you don't need Jews for anti-Semitism, because it's an ideology. It's a way of seeing the world. Stop relating to the world in a Jewish way. Anti-Jewishness at the center. And when Rome became Christian, the anti-Jewish laws started from the very start. So the added power meant more powerful vilification. And this is how Jews became the antithesis of Western society, the opposite to the ideal, everything to not be greedy, disloyal, bloodthirsty, basically immoral and capable of anything after killing the deity. So contemporary anti-Semitism builds on this. And now the Jewish state can be blamed as being the obstruction to humanity. It's still the reason we can't have nice things. It's dangerous to world peace. And to perfect the world, the implication is we need to remove Israel. So after creating the ideology, the themes could be built on and replicated. And again, we go back to Bishop Augustine, who influenced the development of Western philosophy and Christianity. And he said that Judaism is the image of the Jewish people. And what did Judas do? Well, according to Augustine, he stabbed Jesus in the back. And this betrayal by Judas was now represented by all Jews, according to Augustine. So this idea was infamously adopted by the Nazis to explain Germany's loss of World War I with the added element of Jewish power. And you can see in this other cartoon, anti-Zionism has also adopted a similar image with the sleeve and the Star of David and the hidden power behind the back. A modern day Judas. Well, the 2019 elections saw the stab in the back widely adopted by the UK left, and they felt powerless, and this gave them an explanation. And this is the story of conspiracy theory. The same anti-Semitic theme of greedy, disloyal backstabbers and crucifixion and 30 pieces of silver, it all came out from MPs to activists, because thousands of years of these messages cannot be undone quickly, even if they're less overt than this one. Now, anti-Semitism is its own belief system, which no longer requires a church. And like a religious experience, adherents get a feeling of comfort from it, and it makes them feel a bit morally superior. Rumors of Jews causing the Black Plague, called what some historians call the medieval Holocaust. And the story was updated for COVID. So the cruel and immoral Jewish nation withholding the vaccine from Palestinians, as tweeted by the then head of Ben & Jerry's board. And it was reported by some mainstream newspapers in their headlines, despite the fact that it didn't happen. And within the body of their articles, they specified that. The far right, on the other hand, they went from calling it Chinese flu pretty fast to calling it Jew flu. And the idea was that Jews invent or use the vaccine in order to gain more power and control. Now, obviously, there's a clear relationship there with the Nazis referring to Jews as unclean parasites and vermin spreading disease. And again, respectable doctors and health officials, they help spread these lies and give it authenticity. And the same ideas, we can see them projected onto Israel. The idea of Jews being parasites, vermin, dirty creatures to be exterminated, and a threat to humanity. Here's a nice quote. We do from time to time criticize the action of Zionists, but solely on account of their politics, not their race or religion. Anti-Semitism is simply a political smear word. Does anyone think this is left-wing? Anyone think this is right-wing? It's getting really tricky, isn't it? Well, it's the National Front in 1970. I'm just going to move on now to secular fake news about Jews. In 1789, the secular revolution created equal rights and led to the myth that Jews plot to control events for power in a very serious way. Jews had been excluded from society and forced to live in ghettos, usually under armed guard, usually surrounded by water with high mortality rates. But suddenly they were emancipated and they had citizenship and they had rights and they could go where they wanted to and they didn't live under a curfew. So people suddenly saw that their church was demoted and people wanted an explanation of the power change. So if the church's power was given by God, who now was in charge, and what they did is they linked the promotion of Jews and the demotion of the church. Step forward, the father of conspiracy theory, in 1806, a right-wing author called Barruel, he wrote that the revolution was a conspiracy to attack Catholicism by people like the Illuminati and the Knights of the Templar and the Freemasons. And eventually, after many years, he decided that Jews were at the top, controlling all these other groups like puppeteers. Barruel and people like him on the right wanted a counter-revolution. They wanted to turn the clock back. They wanted their church back, or their monarchy back, or their aristocracy back. And the left wanted someone to blame for this new society not being perfect. The main target of this became the Rothschilds, who emerged from the Frankfurt ghetto and became involved in the new tech of the railways. And all this attracted the wrath of the left, as I said, who focused on them and their Jewishness specifically as the primary cause for social inequality, political corruption, and exploitative capitalism. Now we've got another step. In 1846, a left-winger called George Denville printed a myth about the Rothschilds, blaming them for manipulating war. He signed it Satan, which indicates the underlying religious hatred behind it. The Rothschild conspiracy was used by the Nazis in their 1940 film, The Rothschilds, and by the Soviets as well. And today, we see a power shift, not industrialization or the secular revolution, but we have a technological revolution, right? And it's fundamentally altered the way we live and the way we communicate. You can live your life without seeing another human face now. You add COVID to the mix. All this change and uncertainty, this is ripe for projecting a Jewish face on. And these Rothschilds memes, they proved extremely popular among both the left and the right. So you get conspiracies about the Rothschilds controlling the weather, for example, and that can come from any side of the political spectrum. It's okay. Jew moneylenders now control every foreign office in Europe. I'm not going to ask which side of the political spectrum it comes from, because this guy was a conservative and then he became a socialist. And his name is Henry Heinemann, and he founded the first socialist group in the UK in 1881. By the late 1800s, the backlash across Europe against secularism had reached a fever pitch, and with it, an anti-Semitic worldview which blamed the Jews for everyone. So the right, they had a sneering disdain for Jews and thought they were communists and dirty, and the left blamed Jews for imperialism and capitalism. And socialists, nationalists, social reformers combined to incite against Jews. In Britain, it even caused them to pass the first immigration law called the 1905 Alien Act. It was the result of decades of incitement. And this, by the way, this was replicated all across Europe. So 43 unions condemned British Jewish immigration. Labour hero Ben Tillett's anti-Semitic speech at the Trade Union Congress was proto-fascist discourse. Jews were seen as powerful capitalists, undermining conditions, anti-working class, and he even called for Jews, British Jews, to be deported. And eventually all of this inspired actual proto-fascist groups, such as the Britons in 1919, who also wanted British Jews deported just like Tillett. And as I say, Britain's just an example. This was happening all across Europe. So D'Annunzio started the first proto-fascist rule in Fiume, 1919. Lenin sent him a pot of caviar and called him the only revolutionary in Europe. Now, I'm going to give you a quote from Keir Hardie's newspaper. He was the founder of the Labour Party and the first leader, and he was the editor and publisher of this newspaper. Wherever there is trouble in Europe, wherever rumours of war circulate and men's minds are distraught with fear and change and calamity, you may be sure that a hook-nosed Rothschild is at his games somewhere near the region of the disturbances. Now, I find it hard to distinguish between this and Nazi propaganda, which appeared about 40 years later. And the same goes for anarchism. This is from Proudhon, the enemy of mankind. We should send this race back to Asia or exterminate it. And at the center of the thinking was capitalism and communism being controlled by Jews. Fascism did not come out of nothing. Nazism did not come out of nothing. It didn't appear in a vacuum. We like to think of Hitler as this angry, shouting man, but actually, he was more like an influencer, like the social media influencers we think about now. He was talking about healing the nation. It was an attractive proposition for people going through a confidence of crisis, a crisis confidence. So the Nazis were probably the most anti-Christian movement I can think of. What they wanted to do was not value the oppressed, and they wanted to have the ruling class strong. And the 1939 Nazi announcement in Łódź, Poland, about Jews having to wear the yellow star said they were going back to the Middle Ages. A digital version of the yellow star is the parenthesis, the triple parenthesis. It was created by the alt-right, and it even has its own Chrome browser extension to automate the process. And the same goes for the ghetto. You heard about the ghettos. Well, the Warsaw Ghetto was based on the idea of the medieval ghetto. Set fire to their synagogues or schools. The Nazis obviously practiced this, but it comes from Protestant reformer Martin Luther in 1543 in his pamphlet on Jews and their lies. It was the blueprint for Kristallnacht, and Hitler said, Martin Luther has been the greatest encouragement of my life. At this point, I think I should point out that the Holocaust heavily relied on locals voluntarily killing Jews. There were many Holocaust sites across Europe which weren't death camps, but where Jews were killed by cold, by work, by bullets, and many of them were not run by Nazi Germany. An existing anti-Jewish ideology meant that people were already willing participants. Between 1918 and 1921, 100,000 Jews were killed in pogroms, and these pogroms have a stark resemblance to the October the 7th massacre we have seen, particularly with the murder of babies and children. And they were celebratory. We've seen these Hamas terrorists whooping with joy as they committed their crimes. And it was the same with the pogroms. They were like celebratory street theater with bands and cheering and crowds. And I know because my grandmother witnessed one when she was a child, believing it was a party. So what the Soviets did was, despite siding with the Nazis and funding them until about 1942, they not only erased Jews as the victims of the Nazis, but made them the perpetrators. And so you see this almost Nazi-esque caricature of a Jew with an exaggerated nose, and he's a banker and he's kissing the Nazi jackboot. And they put the swastika and they put the Star of David together eventually. And we see this by the left, and we see it by Islamists, and we see it on rallies, and Kanye West on after his ban on Twitter posted it too. And then of course there's the tradition of assigning inferior racial characteristics to Jews, started in, again, medieval England, most commonly known from the Nazis, but it's been revitalized for the internet age with the happy merchant meme. And then there's Google. Until this year, if you had Googled what is a Jew, you would have been faced by a negative connotation. It would have said to bargain with someone in a miserly or petty way. Verb, offensive. There is no other religion which I could find that had this kind of research result. This is hugely worrying. This is the first place that we go to find information. It's Google. And it's there because of the cultural heritage of our ideas. The son of someone I know was introduced to this post by algorithms while he was looking for football material. And it's a fake quote by a neo-Nazi called Kevin Strom. And young people, here is the crucial point, will almost certainly encounter anti-Semitism online before they ever encounter a Jew. Now imagine if you went into a bookshop and you saw that over a quarter of the Holocaust books there were denial or distortion. You would think, this is a neo-Nazi bookstore, and you'd probably walk out. Well, imagine no longer, because a study by Oxford University and the UN in 2022 found that across all platforms on social media, over 16% of material is Holocaust material is denial or distortion. This is shocking. And there's been some revelations about Wikipedia as well, with European nationalists distorting the Holocaust to erase the shame of their countries. And this is really worrying because AI, like ChatGPT, is largely trained in these places. The internet is a neutral place, like the printing press is neutral or the railroad tracks are neutral. They can be used for good things or they can be used for terrible things. And social media is more powerful than the printing press. It's more immediate, it's global, and it affects non-Jews as well. The Bratislava LGBT shooter in 2022 was radicalized online into anti-Semitism. It made him anti-liberty and anti-rights, and killing LGBT people was his way of killing Jews. And in Buffalo, 10 African Americans were killed for the anti-Semitic replacement theory, which I've talked about. A German anti-vaxxer killed his family, believing the vaccination was a Jewish conspiracy. Social media is rife with conspiracy theories, and anti-Semitism is the one conspiracy theory to unite them all. And it's part contempt for what exists, combined with a utopia for a new world. And in the second decade of the 2000s, conspiracies were all brought together under the idea of an all-encompassing conspiracy of secret networks and world control by the elite, which inevitably has Jews, a Jewish face projected onto it, and the Rothschilds at the top of that. So it's time to stop thinking about left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism. Studies, including the most recent Nature Journal study published by the Nature Journal, shows that anti-Semitism comes from people more than likely with a distrust of authority, who are disillusioned and have a penchant for dictatorships and authoritarianism. They want to tear down existing systems. Conspiracy theorists, they create a simple story and they can just rewrite their script to suit. Now, these are worrying times, and they really are. We do have genuine issues. Amazon have so much power. Tech companies like that, they can make and break businesses all over the world, just like that. There are reasons to be scared, but this fear, it manifests in irrational thinking. And this opening of understanding with the internet has also brought an eclipse of reason. I'd like to end with this quote. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those forms that have been tried from time to time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this very encompassing and well, I think we took quite a tour from ancient times to modern times, and back again and back to modern times again, and really shows how all-encompassing this subject is, and how yes, and how strong this subject still is in society, and is deeply rooted in society. And we comfortably passed the 45 minutes, which is fine, and I let you talk because it's a session important, but unfortunately we have a little less time for questions. I don't know whether Alex has some remarks. At least I have some remarks that would also relate to maybe the people watching at home or the people here, is that many of the examples that you gave, being it via the internet or being it the ones from ancient times or being the one from the 20th century, many people spread, for example, the backstabber. I come from a political sphere where I've been called a Judas, a backstabber, for many times. But how many people do you think actually know they are spreading anti-Semitism? How many people are aware that they are spreading this? And how many people are just, well, just to say it quite bluntly, useful idiots?
It's difficult, obviously, to give you an exact amount. But when you think about the way that Soros is depicted, for instance, and the guy rightly deserves criticism. He puts money into politics. He's there to be scrutinized. But the amount of times that we see him blamed for things which he has nothing to do with, like BLM, and we see him depicted as the puppeteer. I mean, this is where criticism of Soros becomes overtly anti-Semitic. And I'm not sure whether people realize it or not, but I think that people definitely should try and understand those things, and they need to be helped to do that.
Are there any questions in the? Yes, sure.
Well, in the first place, I would like to thank the organizer and the speakers for this really important event. I have one question which goes back directly to what you were saying earlier about Wikipedia and the internet in general. I mean, Wikipedia, when it emerged 20 years ago, was seen with skepticism, correctly, I would say, especially by academics, because it was not considered reliable, because anybody can go there and write. Nowadays, Wikipedia is considered to be a reliable tool, but if we go, now I have open in front of me the page of Wikipedia about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it says that the first clashes began in 1920, so it does not mention that the first murders by Arab Muslims of Jews, they were committed in 1919, and it was them who began the actual clashes against the Jewish community. And this is Wikipedia, and I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but they remove a really important piece of the story, which is actually described in history books. And this is an important point, which shows how unreliable online tools are, even the most accredited ones, let's say. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point. Those who control Wikipedia control the truth, right? That's where we go to look up things. That's what people trust. And there's a lot of anti-Semites in the world. And there's not very many Jews. We can't do this by ourselves. We need the help of our friends and allies and just regular people everywhere, really.
May I?
Yeah, Alex, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Great question, and I can bring it up to date. My sense is there's no such thing as a neutral media. I don't think there's any neutral in the same way that there's no neutral writing. It's all in the choice of words or an adverb or a noun. Just to give you an example about how dangerous this whole notion of truth is. It's dangerous, and where Wikipedia can be dangerous and where the BBC, certainly in the UK, are dangerous, is that there's an inherent bias. You just have to open the newsfeed right now of the BBC. I encourage anyone to do it. You'll find every picture coming out from Gaza will have a picture of a baby or destruction, whatever. Any picture relating to Israel, or most pictures relating to Israel, I would say 80% of them are soldiers or in a military context, okay? We wrote to the BBC and we decided we weren't going to take them on over their biased coverage because that ship had sailed long ago. What we asked for was integrity. In the same way that in America, you have a choice between Fox and CNN, and you know broadly which parameters they exist in. If you naturally err towards the conservative side, you go to Fox, and Democrat side, CNN. We asked the BBC Director General just to be honest with his audience and at least have the integrity to own up and say, we don't pretend to be a balanced news organization when it comes to this conflict. And then Jews, we no longer have to bother him ever again. We can just say, thank you for clearing it up. But where it becomes dangerous is where you are acting as an impartial observer and presenting truth, which in fact is not truth. And that's extremely dangerous. And I think Wikipedia, you've just given a great example. It happens in the BBC and it happens all of the time. So I think you need to have your political sharp antennae to realize that a lot of these organizations that profess to be neutral or impartial observers or anything but.
I just want to add that as well, sometimes not including context is just as bad. So, for example, using the BBC again, who are the gold standard and we pay our taxes, so it's important. I'm not saying they're the only offenders, but it's important. They will not tell you that they're getting information from Hamas, and they won't check. And this context should be there, I believe.
Thank you so much. That wraps it up. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Nevertheless, I would like to thank both Alex Hearn, Alex Benjamin for coming here, for explaining this very important subject. And I really, I'm glad this is also streamed online. This will be put on YouTube for people to watch again, to learn from, and to work towards a future where there is more awareness, there is more context in the sense of that there indeed is deeply rooted, intentional, unintentional anti-Semitism, and that we create more awareness within our societies in order to counter it in the future, especially what's happening in the Middle East now, but also is finding its way to our own Western societies, our media, and our social media. So thank you again, and with that, I would like to conclude.